Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to the channel. So I was just playing some Need for Speed Unbound recently. Just grinding away at the levels, having fun, getting the speed pass complete, and it got me thinking about how far we've come as a community, because at this time 10 years ago, we weren't even going to be getting a Need for Speed game. This was the first time where they moved to a 2-year development cycle, truly a 2-year development cycle, but with only one team. So back in 2010, we had Criterion and Black Box before they shut down, alternating releases. But this was the first time where we only had one studio, and it was EA Ghost. They made Rivals in about 8 months and went straight to making 2015, and they knew they weren't going to get it done in a year, so they were given 2 years, and that's when it started the whole 2 years per game, like what Call of Duty does. I love these types of videos where discussion can be sparked in the comments, because I know my community and you guys are some of the nicest people I've ever been around, and I know we can get a good discussion going on a topic like this. So here today I am going to answer the overarching question of, have we fixed Need for Speed? So if you go on to enjoy this video, drop a like and subscribe with notifications turned on so you don't miss a new upload. And yeah, let's get into it. So after the golden era of Need for Speed Underground, Most Wanted, and Carbon, the franchise began to kind of lose its identity, and the developers basically started experimenting with different directions, trying to figure out what the audience wanted, and this led to a period of uncertainty. The series basically just ventured into various subgenres. We had like simulation, arcade. They went everywhere to try to figure out what people wanted. So in 2007, Pro Street marked a significant departure from the street racing roots of the series, and it went to legal track-focused racing, kind of like a race weekend type deal where you build your own car and bring it in race. And that trend continued with the Shift series to a degree in 2009 and Shift 2 Unleashed in 2011, where both games basically leaned heavily into simulation racing and offered a more realistic experience, although I would argue it's not really realistic. You were drifting around corners. It basically felt like the Grid games, if you ever played that. And so while Shift and Shift 2 Unleashed were well received by some for their authenticity and depth, they basically just distanced the franchise from its original identity, and that left myself and other fans basically wishing for the street racing that they had come to love to return. And during the same period, Black Box was under intense pressure. Their output noticeably declined in quality with Pro Street and Undercover, although I do like Undercover. Some people really hate me for that. Both of which were heavily criticized at release. Undercover in particular, it was met with confusion and distaste because people played a completely different version of the game. They played the PS2 version, which was developed by Exian and not Black Box, and it used assets from Most Wanted, including the game's engine and map. And these versions featured rearranged parts of the Most Wanted map with reskinned textures to basically resemble the shape and scenery of Tri-City Bay on the Xbox 360 and PS3 versions. And this in turn led to a fragmented experience across all the platforms, and basically we were all puzzled as to why the game felt so different depending on the console. So meanwhile, in 2009, while Need for Speed Shift was being developed, Need for Speed Nitro, which was an over-the-top arcadey style experience made for the Wii and DS, this was the game that those platforms got, because Shift was just a game that was not going to run on these platforms. And while the game was fun, it didn't align with what most fans expected, and the reality was that Black Box was being stretched way too thin, especially as they were tasked with multiple projects at the same time, which was when Electronic Arts decided to bring Criterion into the fold. So these guys, best known for the Burnout series, you guys know who Criterion are, why am I even explaining? They were brought in to revitalize the franchise, and that brought with it skepticism, because these guys were only used to the insane drift handling and crazy crashes and stuff that Burnout was known for. Could they really handle the legacy of Need for Speed? They quickly proved that they could, because the first game they dropped was Hot Pursuit 2010. It was a reboot of the classic games, and it brought back the high-speed police chases that we've missed. So while they delivered the goods, Black Box was still in the picture, but they were struggling more than ever. 2010 was pretty much the year that killed Black Box, as they were told to make 3 games: Need for Speed World, Skate 3, and The Run. And that workload basically meant that none of these games received the polish that they needed and the time and attention to detail that was so desperately needed for these games to succeed. The Run in particular was a huge disappointment. Many fans did not like it. It's Black Box's final game, and it's also their worst. It was incredibly short, very linear story. The gameplay was not very fun at all. And EA's plan at the time was to alternate between Criterion and Black Box to basically keep the series fresh and allow for more development time, just like what they do with Call of Duty now. You have Treyarch release a game one year, you have Infinity Ward release a game one year, and then you have Sledgehammer release a game. So the one example with this, and the only example of this, was Need for Speed Hot Pursuit and Need for Speed The Run. After that, Black Box was closed. So Criterion's involvement brought back the quality the series desperately needed, And it also allowed for them to focus on one thing because they no longer had to share the development load with Black Box. And I just want to touch on this too. Black Box's closure hit especially hard for somebody like myself who grew up with the games that they released during Need for Speed's peak. And it was just surreal to see the fall from grace that this studio had because they went from their humble beginnings developing the PS2 port of Hot Pursuit 2, coming in as kind of like a one-time thing, not really expecting much, but exceeding expectations and being brought in to develop all the games going forward, to now being closed because of such a terrible release, simply because they could not manage their time. They were spread way too thin by Electronic Arts, and it's just classic EA not knowing how to manage their developers and then closing them once they realize that, you know, they did something wrong, but it's somehow the developer's fault, if that makes sense. So with Black Box out of the picture, we got Need for Speed Most Wanted 2012 from Criterion, and then we formed EA Ghost. So EA Ghost, their first game was Need for Speed Rivals in 2013. Although it was a decent effort and was developed with some input from Criterion, it still very much suffered from a short development cycle and a distinct lack of polish. And Ghost games after that were given 2 years to develop the next game. This was the first time they had ever given a Need for Speed game 2 years of development. So we got Need for Speed 2015. It was just called Need for Speed, but people labeled it as 2015 to avoid confusion with previous titles. And this game was a return to the Underground series with, you know, the tuner cars, the customization, the drifting, the drag racing, and all that. The handling was not very good at all. Grip builds were a complete joke. It was insanely repetitive, with it always being nighttime and raining. The game attempted to have police, but it was some of the worst police ever. You could do 30 miles an hour and the police would not be able to keep up with you at all. So the game did have a lot of holes, and those holes were fixed for the most part in 2017's Need for Speed Payback. But with all of the steps forward that Need for Speed Payback took, they took one massive step back, and that massive step back was because this game had loot boxes. I bet you guys were waiting for me to drop that classic EA term. So let me explain, for those who did not play the game, how Need for Speed Payback worked, because it was just a loot box racer basically. So after you finished a race, you could choose from one of 3 cards, and this card would be a certain part for your vehicle. It could be an engine, it could be an exhaust, and it would carry a stat point to increase its performance. You could also re-roll these cards at a slot machine in Vegas by just rolling and rolling and rolling and rolling forever. You can only guarantee one stat. You could guarantee its level, you could guarantee its base stat, or you can guarantee what brand it is. And there were 2 different combinations of cards that basically guaranteed you that your car would perform at its highest level. That was the Chidori set effect and the Outlaw set effect. If you didn't run any of those, you basically lost every single race online. And this becomes a problem because the progression becomes unnecessarily grindy. I do think that there was one other set of, I think it was Americana, because you could regain nitrous by jumping in the air, but that was only useful for off-road events because you're not racing. When you're doing street races, you're not going airborne very much, so it's not gonna do you any good. It sucks because this game was so good, but the fact that we're just sitting around hoping that we land on a card that has the correct stats for our vehicle, it just isn't fun. That's not how we upgrade cars in real life. We put the actual parts on. We don't hand in a card that magically, you know, juices up the performance of the car. That's not how it works. So Payback in particular, overshadowed by the monetization and the progression, and that alienated the fan base even further. So Payback was EA's typical trying to push monetization on yet another series, and that basically made me say, save the franchise. And the franchise was saved temporarily. In 2019, we got Need for Speed Heat, and dude, this game is on par hype-wise and reception-wise with how Most Wanted 05 was back when it released. This game did everything right. It was cops versus racers, with the police being some of the best since Rivals. Illegal racing, customization, engine swaps were now a thing. We had crazy body kits. You had the ability to now customize exotic cars. You couldn't really adjust the body kit on those, but the fact that the developers let us do that now is awesome. So Heat was a absolute love letter for the fans that were patient and waited for the series to basically return to those glory days of Most Wanted. And then COVID-19 happened, to which Ghost games were shut down and spread all across EA. The studio is now EA Gothenburg, and they're a support studio that helps with a bunch of different titles. So Criterion returned to the series, and in 2022 they made Need for Speed Unbound. And this at the time was not very well received, but as the years went on and the game got more support, it managed to be a significant turning point for the franchise. So despite almost no marketing and no last-gen console support, the game still managed to be well received by fans. Criterion had a focus on the street racing and customization that Ghost had for Heat, and it was a very, very interesting art style. We had animated characters. Now, I briefly mentioned this existing in Need for Speed Nitro, but this was a kind of cel-shaded art style with the characters being almost like comic books, kind of, and that extended to the vanity items that you could put on your car. You could change the tire smoke and make it more animated, and this was pretty cool. We hadn't really seen anything like this for a mainline title. We kind of just had it for Nitro because it was basically an enhancement title, if you want to call it that, or a support title, because EA desperately needed to throw something on the platform for that year. So 2 years after its release, we're in 2024 now, 2 years after Unbound's release, EA and Criterion have been consistent with content updates, new cars, events, quality of life improvements. We've gotten tons of crossovers with old games. We're about to have the Hot Pursuit update, so that's something new to play. The drifting system in the game has been completely overhauled with a new set of tires that now introduces traditional drifting. Drag races are now back. Those elements that made the old games perfect are now back, and this level of post-launch support is something that we haven't seen much of during the series' rougher years. I will admit that I was very wrong about Need for Speed Unbound when it first came out, but as I waited and watched new stuff being added over the months and years, it's now become one of the more liked games that I have. When people make their tier lists and stuff, I put Unbound on the same level as Pro Street and Undercover, how they're seen now. So the community, some people like it, some people hate it. I've seen a majority have positive reception of this game, and we have the modding community now that are making cool stuff to play around with. We had the Unite team for Need for Speed Heat, and they're working on Unbound as well, adding tons of stuff, completely unrestricting engine swaps. You can put any engine from any car into any car you want, and you could never do that with Heat. They added that capability into the game as well, and all of the cops are modded to be a lot harder, and there's new events and tons of stuff. It's a good time for Need for Speed because now we didn't have this technology that we do now as we did back in the day. You kind of just got what you got and enjoyed it, or you didn't. Now we can add what we want. And EA is not like Activision. They won't cease and desist something that attempts to compete with Need for Speed. Obviously, if it's monetized, they'll take it down. But they're not making a profit off of this. They're doing it out of a love for the franchise, and that's why none of this stuff has been taken down. If you look at Activision, H2M, gone. SM2, gone. X-Labs, out of here. The BO3 client, kaput. It's terrible. But they aren't like EA, and that's a good thing. So, to answer the question, have we fixed Need for Speed? So far, yes. I do need a little bit more time, though. We need to see what they come up with whenever their next title is, because Criterion was moved to Battlefield fairly recently and did not have any time to work on a new Need for Speed, which is where all these content updates come from. They want to tide us over while we wait for the next game. I would say the next game comes out maybe in 2026, I don't know, but it's going to be interesting to see what route they go, if they keep this cel-shaded art style from Unbound, or if they go back to a more realistic route. Either way, it's a very exciting time for the community, so I hope you guys enjoyed. Leave your thoughts down below in the comments, and yeah, I will see you guys in whatever video I upload next. Take care.